In the late 1870s and early 1880s, European colonial empires controlled less than 10% of Africa. By the beginning of World War I, 90% of Africa was under European domination. The reasons why can sometimes be overlooked, yet they're nonetheless important when discussing something that altered the entire world, caused suffering and death in scales that are unimaginable. Europeans have been interested in Africa since Alexander the Great. He took Egypt from the Persians and gave it to one of his generals, Ptolemy. He started a dynasty that would rule over Egypt until Cleopatra. Starting with the Second Punic War and ending in 493 AD, the Romans were also in North Africa. The best emperor, Nero,
burn the city to the ground while I play my fiddle.
sent an expedition down south through Egypt to find the source of the Nile, and the soldiers he sent reached as far south as Sudan. The Vandals ruled over large portions of North Africa after Rome, and after them came Byzantines. It seemed at this point that the North Africans would always be under the influence of the Europeans, yet once Islam swept through North Africa, the Europeans were gone until the Middle Ages. Normans and other Italian cities started probing into the region with some success, if only temporarily. The Portuguese and Spanish started to gobble up land in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. Later, the French and the British were also involved for a short period of time. Most of these incursions were often failures and did not last long. They were also limited to North Africa. At this point, it is also important to touch upon slavery. All the nations I've mentioned have been involved, and the latter few were involved in the Atlantic slave trade. Oftentimes, the Europeans involved were operating in outposts off the coast of Africa and worked with the local Africans. Once the scramble had begun, most nations went on an anti-slavery campaign, and this was used as a loose justification for some of the conquest. Regardless of their intentions or the legality of slavery in the participating nations, only a few benefited from the scramble, while the vast majority suffered through decades of persecution. By 1880, the only major territories under European control were the Cape Colony, Algeria, Angola, and Mozambique, held by the British, French, and the latter two by the Portuguese respectively. Prestige of exploration and the simple yearning for adventure led many people to simply leave and go into the interior of the continent. They often came back with tales of gold, ivory, and rubber. Many people saw a fortune to be made, yet one man saw a solution to a potential European war. Enter Otto von Bismarck. The Chancellor of Germany. While he hated colonies and did not want to bear the cost of maintaining colonies, he understood that a European war would be unwinnable for Germany. This led him and a few others to put together a conference of diplomats that represented a total of 14 nations in the hopes of dividing Africa to avoid bloodshed. I will put a link in the description that describes what each nation wanted and got out of the conference. It's a video by, oh God, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Boldaga Mapping. I watch his videos pretty often, I just can't pronounce the name. But yeah, it's a really good video and you should check it out if you want to know more info about the conference. While the conference operated much as Bismarck had hoped, in the end it only caused temporary success. Nations involved would often dispute some of the land and even got into small conflicts in Africa over said land. It would take hours to explain every minute encounter between the colonizers and all the crises involved. I will, however, address a few of those that I think shaped the relations between the great powers. The Fashoda incident was a moment where world history could have perhaps shifted entirely. The British wanted to create what they called the Cape to Cairo Railway, which was a vertical axis through Africa, and it would connect the majority of the British domains in Africa. It would be from the Cape of Good Hope to the Mediterranean Sea. This contradicted the French plans to create a horizontal axis from Djibouti to Dakar. This would connect the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, the Atlantic. It doesn't take a genius to realize that they couldn't both get what they wanted, so obviously it had to all come to a head. The French moved a small force into what is now Sudan and South Sudan to take control of the region. The British countered this by sending a force over 10 times the size of the French expedition. The French would subsequently kowtow and give control over the region to the British. This was a massive PR victory for the British, and a disappointing loss for the French. Yet there was a silver lining in this issue. There was no bloodshed. Due to the civility of it and the formation of the Triple Alliance between the Germans, Austrians, and Italians in 1882, the French started to look at the British more and more as a buffer to the hugely powerful German Empire. After Fashoda, British and the French came to a few agreements in 1904. While not anything formal in terms of an alliance, it was still pivotal in announcing colonial boundaries. The French agreed to respect the British in Egypt, and the British agreed to respect the French in Morocco. The Germans loved this. Kaiser Wilhelm II decided that he was going to stick it to the French. He went to Morocco and talked to the Sultan. Wilhelm proclaimed that he was going to support the independence of Morocco. The Sultan then called for a conference based on German advice, and that conference is now called the Algiers Conference. The foreign minister of France basically said, "Fuck off." The German chancellor then threatened war.
Looks like we've got a real Mexican standoff here, boys.
However, no one really wanted the war. They all knew this could be resolved. During the conference, there were 13 different nations involved, the majority of whom sided with the French, with only Austria-Hungary siding with Germany. Due to this, German and French opinions of each other dropped substantially. Arguably, the most important development out of this crisis was that the British backed the French during the conference. They mutually worked together to block Germany's intentions. This would, less than a decade later, lead to them allying and creating the Entente during the Great War. It makes sense that if there's a first Moroccan crisis, there must be a second. The French were in control of Morocco, but the local population hated them. There was a rebellion, and the French sent a force to stop it from harming any French settlers. The Germans responded to this by sending 2 gunships to Agadir to protect their interests in the area. British then sent a ship in response. As it was all going down, the German financial system started to fall apart, fearing that the war was about to happen. The Kaiser then decided to back down. Scramble for Africa can be looked at in a few different ways, and in my opinion, it's merely a time buffer for the European nations to avoid a European war. From 1815 to 1914, it was arguably the most peaceful time in Europe since Rome. For the European elites and even the regular everyday people of Europe, the scramble was something that benefited them. However, the scramble only ended up creating a scenario in which alliances and counter-alliances were established. When the war broke out, the events that occurred in the scramble facilitated the death and destruction of the trenches. I would be remiss to not get into the devastation that occurred. Regardless of their intentions, the colonial nations caused enslavement, rape, torture, and death to occur on a scale that hasn't been heard of since the Mongols. Whether it be from the Congo Free State, in which every bullet fired had to be accounted for by taking a hand, or the machinations of British businessmen such as Cecil Rhodes, or even the Italian wars in Abyssinia, or a dozen other conflicts. The death and destruction is clearly in the millions, and I've seen it as high as 30 million. That could perhaps be the entire takeaway of this video. World War I, the interwar period, World War II, decolonization also killed tens of millions of people. Look at the Scramble for Africa, one must realize that every nation involved committed acts of terror that would now be classified as crimes against humanity. In the description, I'm also going to drop some videos on this topic by other channels. They kind of inspired me to talk about this topic, and anyone serious about history should give the videos a watch. I'll also drop some more videos by Smith. For anyone that made it this far, I really appreciate it, and I hope that I can make more informative content. Thanks.